You have all of these innovations within the industry, whether it's communication, software. You and I were chatting a little bit about how the automotive industry is coming into this space, and you can speak to that, way better than I. But that's interesting to me. If you live in a community and you have all these great technologies out there that are app-based, let's say whether it's a bicycle or a car that's part of being part of your community, you can use the car, use the bike, and that's an added value to that community. Okay, hear me out. The community looks at it and goes, God, that's a great idea. I can see how we would get higher ratings. People will be attracted to us. Oh, wait a minute. How much is this going to cost us? Right? They look at the cost of it rather than the value of it.
Right.
So that's the pleasure
Price
sale.
versus,
This is the pleasure sale. We're going to tell you how great it's going to make you look. Well, then they pass on that opportunity. Guess what? The competitor down the street's doing it, and now they passed on it. So now the pain sets in. Well, they're losing market share, and everybody's raving on everything, whether it's Yelp, online surveys, and saying this community is amazing. They actually provide transportation within the community. It's like a concierge service, much like being at a hotel and have a shuttle service. Imagine that. Hotels have been doing that for decades. And we rant and rave about
W, right?
Yeah, or wherever. You see certain hotels, you're not going to get it. And the other ones we pay extra because we're going to get it, whether it's airport, shuttle, or otherwise. So now this company who passed on it feels the pain.
Right.
It says, oh, now we have to spend the money. Guess what? Now it's more expensive. You already lost market share. So your lost opportunity is more than it was when you had an opportunity 90 days ago to do it.
Right.
So it was the pain that triggered it rather than the pleasure of opportunity to be first mover.
That's Mike Lindstrom. He's an author, keynote speaker, and communication expert who was trained early in life by Tony Robbins on psychology of influence. Under the Robbins organization, Mike worked as an executive coach for Fortune 500 companies across North America, becoming one of the youngest executive coaches in the Robbins Results Coaching Company. He's a straight-shooting, passionate leader who went out on his own after seeing the client base swell to more than 5,000 professionals. His impressive client base reads like a who's who in corporate America, with a list of corporate executives, professional athletes, celebrities, and even teenagers seeking that next level. Michael focuses on results and accountability. He appears on national and local media outlets like Fox News, CNN, Headline News to comment on topical issues.
You're listening to the Multifamily Leadership Podcast with Patrick Antrim, your source for success strategies for multifamily professionals, CEOs, executive leaders, and aspiring leaders that want to drive high-performance results for their property or portfolio.
This is Patrick Antrim, founder and CEO of Multifamily Leadership and producer of the Multifamily Leadership Summit, where top multifamily executives come together in a one-of-a-kind leadership summit to design fresh ideas for the future of multifamily. Welcome to the Multifamily Leadership Podcast, where I speak to executive leaders, authors, and business leaders on the topics that advance leadership in multifamily. It is our goal to give you insight into what top leaders are doing to re-envision the leasing experience and leading the apartment of the future. If you'd like to get access to other resources like videos, articles, show notes, other episodes of this podcast, or information on working with me, you can visit multifamilyleadership.com.
Mike, so thanks for coming in today to the studio. It's always nice to have you in. You being a Scottsdale guy, and
we can make this happen all the time. That's one thing I love about being here. The commute is what, 5 miles?
Yeah, not only that, but getting you is probably one of the hardest guests to book, though, because you're always traveling. You were just in LA doing some really cool stuff. But I wanted to bring you on today and talk to you about how people learn. I mean, you talked earlier in some of your keynotes about unconscious, not knowing all these different aspects, but we're in a world now where we need to not only learn new technologies, but we're learning how to adopt them. So tell me a little bit about what is the process people go through when we're learning new things?
Yeah, it's funny, when I first was really brought this to my attention was when I graduated law school. So you have to understand, Patrick, like 3 years of law school, you are trained learning logic. Black, white, middle. You have the prosecution, you have the defense, you have two different sides, and you have to figure out what the facts are. So for 3 years, you're brainwashed to think a certain way, number one. And two, the way law school is taught, it's called the Socratic method. The Socratic method has been around for obviously many, many years. Socrates is the one that came up with this concept. about questions. You never really answer the question. You just ask questions with questions to get people to think. So this is what they do in law school. So you pay these professors a lot of money to go to this great private school in San Diego. You ask a simple question because you're the student, kind of like in college or high school, and they answered your questions. They don't do that in law school. They ask, well, I don't know, Mr. Lindstrom, well, what do you think the answer is? And I'm like, well, I don't know, buddy. I pay you the money to answer the question. So I go through 3 years of logic training and learning. Then I get thrown into the world of personal development, working for Tony Robbins, which is more emotional learning, not logical learning or Socratic learning. But it's similar because, the Robbins kind of method is you ask a lot of questions. Quality of questions equals the quality of your life, et cetera. Most people don't ask good questions of self. They ask bad questions, you get bad answers. We talk to ourselves at 1,000 words a minute. So I'm thrown into this world, and I realized that learning this part of it takes practice and repetition, right? Repetition is the mother of skill. So I go from this logic training learning to this emotional learning, and I realized there's these 4 levels of awareness. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. But learning is really about being exposed to certain things initially and then doing it consistently over time, much like learning a language. I don't know about you. I took Spanish in high school. It was a requisite. My first lessons were words. You had to know what a house was. You had to say boy, girl, chair. So the first semester was all words. The second semester, you learned structure. So verbs. How do you put the noun with the verb? Then the next semester, it's put the sentence together. The next semester, it's conversation. Hopefully, if you're decently studying, you get to the 4th semester, 2nd year, you're actually conversing in the language. So it's the same thing. The moment I stepped my sophomore year into Spanish, I knew very little words, much like communication. But after that first year, I feel I knew enough words, I knew enough verbs, I might hear and understand it, but I wasn't fluent. And I realized that was the same thing that I was learning in personal development, being on the road and working with corporations. Once you understand basic words, sentence structure, you put it all together, now you have communication, thus learning.
So how long did it take to really unpack that sort of... I went through California Receivers Forum right when the market changed for all of real estate, and I was learning to be a court appointed receiver.
Got it.
And so we went through some legal. I mean, it was 23 sessions. It was my little sizzle or taste of legal study, and I think it was the word Iraq. I don't know if you remember it, but it's the issue rule, application, and conclusion. Yeah. And so what's fascinating is I actually used that in a lot of different ways.
I had no idea.
I know, right? And I use that in a lot of leadership examples to try and move things to create non-defensive, behavior. So I would, instead of attacking the person, say, well, what's the issue here? What's the rule? And I even would say, refer to the rule, whatever the rule is. If it's a policy, the real issue is we don't have a policy for that.
Right.
So we would solve that instead of dealing with the person. So it's kind of interesting, but I did it the other way around. I learned the law later, and just a little piece of it, not to the depth of study you went through. But how long did it take? Because a lot of what's happening in the world and how we're interacting with consumers online, and just the way that we're the technology, autonomous vehicles, and all these things are changing in our landscape of how we approach business. A lot of companies are learning that we have to unlearn some things. So what was that like to shift from, that legal approach to then, that emotional leadership role with Tony Robbins?
The thing for me was like anybody, when you learn something new, you're always asking the question, well, what's it like? It's kind of like when you see an object or maybe a fruit or vegetable, what's it taste like? What's it smell like? I was doing the same thing for the first year. So I was applying these new emotional principles, communication principles that were based in personal development and going back to, well, what's this kind of like? And I realized it was very similar. So we learned in school, 3rd grade, probably composition. You have introduction, body, conclusion, right? Tell me what you're going to tell me. Tell me what you told me. 3rd grade, we learned that. We wrote essays like that in college. We wrote like that in law school, but it was called issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. So similar. So when you go into the world of negotiating or communication or influence, it's no different. Tell me what you're going to tell me. Tell me what you told me. And apply these principles of learning. So if you're sitting across from somebody who doesn't know neurolinguistics, they don't understand behavior, they don't understand the psychology of influence, that person sitting across from you doesn't have the level of fluency that you have. So you go back to some of those fundamental things. You tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. but then you educate them through the lens of, hey, they may not be aware. Let's get them basically the nouns and the verbs. Let's put the sentences together. And hopefully by the end of this day or session or training, they can somewhat form a sentence and then go practice this stuff. So when they go talk to an employee, when they go parent, they can actually start using these skill sets to be more of an influencer at a different level. So for me, it was a good year and a half. And I averaged about 10 or 12 live speaking events a week for about a year. So, I mean, do the math. I've worked 50 weeks times 10. So let's say 500 plus presentations. And, if you read Gladwell or some of the more modern day writers, they'll say, proficiency or expertise may not happen until 10,000, depending on what your sport, whether it's a golf swing or throwing a baseball or whatever it is. So 500 as a 25, 26-year-old kid for me, I wasn't quite there. The next year I was thrown into the world of coaching when I came off the road, and I was doing 12 to 13 coaching calls per day. Okay, so think about that. That's not, I don't recommend that, by the way. I mean, we were overwhelmed and overworked in that organization. There was only probably 24 of us working with thousands of clients. So we did what we had to do. But imagine I'm doing 12 a day times 5, 60 coaching calls a week. So you multiply that out. I became very good at spot recognition, pattern recognition. That next year, so that second full year, I started to get it. I'm like, okay, now I can hear it in somebody's voice, their language patterns. I can see what they don't see, show them the blind spots, and then I go back to the fundamentals. Tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, so they can walk away from an event or coaching relationship or session and start to apply this stuff for themselves. So it's a good 2 years. But I have to remember the job that I was in, Patrick, I was immersed. Most of the clients I work with are not immersed. I just had 10 coaching calls today with clients that have full-time jobs, 60 hours a week. And I've got 45 minutes with that person to teach them a chunk of a sliver of all of the stuff I did for 2 years every day. So that person's going to take years and years and years. And that's if they're committed to mastery. Right. But if you can say, hey, by the way, I'm going to take a month off, go do this 12 hours a day for a month and just practice pattern recognition and listen to language patterns and understand what you don't know. Yeah, you can cut the corners and speed up the timeline. That's just not reality for most people.
Right. What do you talk a lot about patterns.
Right.
As a leader, executive leader, looking at their followers, their employees, those that they're influencing, how important is that to understand patterns?
Yeah, pattern recognition is huge. It's huge with anything, whether it's a baseball player, it's like a good hitter. They know how to see the pitch right out of the batter's hand.
Spotting trends in the marketplace. There's
financial
data.
Planner, doctor. Right. You go into the doctor's office, they can look at a skin rash in a heartbeat and say, I know exactly what that is. I can issue spot it, right? What it apply to it, and what are we going to include, whether it's a medicine or whatever. It's the same thing with anything. A salesperson. You can tell a good salesperson could sit across from somebody in 10 minutes and say, okay, this is somebody who's probably not bought in. They're going to need time to think about it. I'm not going to hard close this right now. So whatever you do, the pattern recognition is important. However, it's the repetition aspect of it. So if you're only doing 2 meetings a week in your sport or profession, it's going to take you a long time. So I encourage people to just go fail a bunch, go get in front of a bunch of people. I don't care if it's even in a non-working environment. I've had clients that would call themselves introverts that are in corporate environments that say, just go out socially. You're not going to be in 12 corporate meetings a week, but guess what? You're going to talk to somebody at the checkout stand at the supermarket. You're going to talk to the guy or gal getting your order at Starbucks. You're going to go to a party. You're going to do a nonprofit event. In a given week, if you went out of your way, you can be around people and practice introversion communication, so you can practice being a little bit more extroverted. You're not going to change who you are. It's your DNA. Right. Person, it's nurture nature. But if you said, hey, at least 10 times a week, I'm going to put myself out of my comfort zone and work on this aspect of self. So that's where I think a lot of people don't do, unless they have a coach or they have somebody like a boss or somebody in their culture or their company that forces them to go do those things. Most people don't get the repetition that they ever need.
Right. And so, I mean, does this take us back to what you've coined the awareness model about having awareness, self-awareness, and knowing that you don't know and approaching it that way? Or is it that persistence? I mean, you're a guy that's grown up in that accountability role, and you recognize the value. I mean, a lot of executive leaders are paying you to fly from office to office because they know it impacts results. Right. And they know that the quicker they get to the real issue, the bigger change can make. But how does somebody, if an executive leader out there, how do you encourage that? I mean, if they don't naturally have that self-awareness, because we have blind spots.
Right. Well, let's go back to that. The awareness model. Yeah. The force, let me break that down. So you have the awareness model starts with force, the first step, and it's a progression or syntax. It has to follow an order in time. The first level is when you're unconsciously incompetent. That means you don't know what you don't know. It's just completely out of your awareness. You don't think about it, whether it's consciously or subconsciously. It's so far removed from your brain, it doesn't even enter the brain space, period. Right?
And that's like autonomous vehicles right now, that the innovation that's happening, there's people that don't even know that vehicles can,
right, but that's
can even see,
Think about this, the information in the world or the universe, if you look at your brain and my brain, if you put it on a pie graph of the 4 levels of awareness, the bottom level being unconsciously incompetent, the bulk of the pie graph is that. You know how many things we don't know? Right. That we're not even aware of, whether it's the universe, space, time, math. I mean, the majority of our pie graphs are going to be dominated by things that we don't even know, we're not even aware of.
Right.
But if we become curious about the world and people, we graduate to the second level, which is now we're consciously incompetent. We now know about this thing, but we don't know it. Like we just talked about the solar eclipse recently, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I understand it conceptually, but all the physics that go into it, I'm now consciously aware of what I don't know. I understand how the moon and the sun and the earth move. I get all that part. But when you have like scientists at NASA that can tell you down to a fraction of a quarter mile of how the sun and the shade is going to hit when the earth is spinning on its axis, I have no idea about that. Right. But I'm aware that it's out there, but I'm not aware of it in influence, right?
Sure.
So it's consciously incompetent. So I'm consciously incompetent to that whole concept. But let's say I go out in the next 6 months and study it, and I Google it, and I pull up all the NASA articles, and I get pretty proficient, where I can actually do a seminar on it and say, hey, I'm not a scientist, but I did my homework. I can now get up here and be consciously competent. So I know what I know. I'm not the best at it, but I know what I know. I'm enough to be dangerous. So that's the third level. So I keep practicing, and I say, I want to go back and go to college, get my PhD, and I'm going to go work at NASA in the next 5 years. So I go do that. Now I'm one of the guys on TV that we saw last week. Now I'm unconsciously competent. I saw a guy yesterday talking about the solar eclipse. He was on CNN. They were asking him, like, the solar eclipse, is that like the Super Bowl for NASA? Right? And he says, it's the Super Bowl. It's the hockey playoff, Stanley Cup. It's the World Series, all wrapped in one. And he just starts rapping all this science jargon off. He's so unconsciously competent to these things that the average viewer, myself included, I have no idea what he's talking about.
Right.
All I know is at 10:34 Arizona time, we're going to have 62% of the sun blacked out. And here's how I look at it. I'm good. This guy is geeked because that's all he knows. He's so fluent at that language called physics and the world that is. So that's his thing. For me, my unconscious competence is communication, pattern recognition in people, and be able to pick up on congruences in whether it's eye movements, tone of voice, head movements, things of that nature in communication. So the more I empower a sales team, a leadership team, how to pick up on those cues and they practice it, they might get to a level of consciously competent.
Right.
But it's very rare that I have a coaching client who jumps full throttle, goes get certified in something, takes time out of work, goes to classes. They just don't have time. So my job is to speed those timelines up, expedite the learning curve. So at least you know enough where you could be a little bit more effective in that communication.
And there are people that are leaders not coaching others outside their, they're not professional coaches, but they're coaching inside their business because they understand that people are their, last real competitive advantage. So how important is understanding character in others, character styles, or just getting outside of self to move through these things? I mean,
right. Well, I mean, that goes back to behavior. Behavior is simply how we act. So you have identity on one hand, which is the title, you're a male, female, mother, father. Those are the roles that we wear, right, as human beings.
But we get caught up in business. We get fast. We're adjusting. There's liabilities on the line. There's capital events where people are rushing the process because there's pressures, performance. And now we're seeing a lot of different communities impacted with things that are going outside of our control. And so it's hard to have that patience and develop that. That persistence, that candid persistence that you're talking about. So What's the approach there? I mean, how do you?
Yeah, I go back to the whole, curiosity factor. People are not going to share your belief system. They're not going to share your history. They're not going to share your value system. You may value money, making more money than you do recognition. I just had, 2 different individuals today, 2 different companies. One really wants to be recognized by his company for the title that is the end of your sales people who make a trip, right? They put them in the top 10%. Right. They go on this beautiful trip. The other one, a different company in the same space, he's like, I don't care about the trip. He goes, in fact, if I get on the list, I want to be the guy at the bottom because I don't want to be number one. I don't need to work that hard. I'm in late 40s. I got 3 kids. One's in swim, one's in gymnastics, one's in baseball. I like to be that dad who's present because he values family and just be able to provide at the level he wants in his family. He can give 2 cents about the recognition of a sales chart that comes out once a month. So our value systems are very important. But the problem is though with leaders, sometimes we forget this because we try to impart our value system on an employee or a team.
Make assumptions.
Right. Instead of just asking, going back to the curiosity filter and sit down with somebody who you struggle with and say, hey, I know this is how I might do it. And I don't expect that. I'm just curious, like from your vantage point, how do you view your role? How do you monitor success or failure for your position? Where do you want to be in a year? Instead of telling and frustrating because that person's not living up to your paradigm, you just go back to the curiosity filter and draw it out of them. That's the best way to do it.
Right. And that creates intrinsic results. I mean, that's the motive. I mean, how does it, getting them talking about the solution in their own words or the vision you're trying to create in your own words.
Well, that's the beautiful thing about elicitation. When you ask questions, you're eliciting their beliefs and their value system and what they hold to be true in their own mind. Remember, whatever you believe, you're right. It was Ford that said that. If you believe you can, you're right. If you believe you can't, you're right. Yeah. So it's the same concept. But when you get somebody to articulate it in their own language patterns, as listener, as coach, as advisor, mentor, leader, we get to hear what limitations are. We all see blind spots in people. That's why they're called blind spots. We can't see our own blind spots unless we hire somebody or have somebody that's going to hold us to that standard. But eliciting those things helps that person articulate their own self-limiting beliefs, their own goals, rather than us imparting that on other people.
So we've been talking a lot about coaching, leadership, and those things. I mean, and sales comes into that play, but there are a lot of companies in our space that are successful. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't argue with their success. They've accomplished greatness within their business units, their communities, and financially as well. And the founders have great profiles. But what does success play into that? We can get romantic about what's worked in the past. Mm-hmm. Can we get on our heels and miss opportunities, or should we always be sort of checking in, even if we're on top, we're number one?
Right. I love that concept of, great leaders are always innovating, not just the company, the product, but the culture of the company, themselves. I had a mentor years ago when I was getting into startup companies back in the turn of 2000, 2002. And he said, in this space, .coms, at that time, reinvention was a sexy word. Innovation was a sexy word because things were moving so quick. People were selling business plans to investors off of domain names without even a business behind it. So those days are well gone. Obviously, after 2000, 2001, everything crashed and the market shifted. But you start thinking about innovation and change. That's the same thing with how we define success or failure. But great leaders, great companies are always looking in the mirror. I love that concept that Jim Collins talks a lot about. He wrote the original book, Good to Great, and he's updated it since. Great leaders are always confronting the brutal facts of the situation, much like military leaders. They don't just go in there and hope. They have contingency plans. They have rules of engagement. They've got plans A, B, and C before they go into warfare or whatever the situation is. So it's the same thing in corporate America. If you don't have a plan B or you don't have a plan of innovation, you're just staying still. And you know the rule, if you're not growing, you're dying. Whether it's your product or your personal brand, you always got to be working on yourself.
Right. I mean, that works in a garden. I mean, if it's not, you got to protect the things around it. How about understanding how we act? I mean, you touched on that a little bit, but are people, and then this happens in sales because you have different styles of people want to hear the information up front or they want to hear the story and these types of things. How does communication play a part in that and getting results through a company and understanding how I act? I mean, how do you test that? I mean, it's not software.
Right.
Is it asking,
Actually,
and if you're the boss and you ask, hey, how am I doing as a leader? Well, you're doing great. They're bought into the fact that you have positional power, influence over the paycheck and those kinds of things. How does a true leader understand really how they're perceived
I'm surprisingly or not, about 2/3 of Fortune 500 companies use some form of a tool, an objective, accurate tool to measure behavior. For example, you have the DISC profile, which measures dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. It's an acronym. You have the Colby, which I've seen a lot of companies. You have the Drake. You've got of course, Briggs, which measures extroversion, introversion, and things of that nature. So these are objective tools that leaders can use, and I'm a big proponent. I have clients that want to use. I use the DISC personally with clients and corporations, but I've got clients of mine that do multiple. You have the Strengths Finders. They did a great job with the Gallup, coming up with your top 5 core strengths out of 25 plus strengths that you might gravitate towards.
Right.
You have value evaluation, which that doesn't just talk about behavior. It's how you make decisions. Do you filter through money? Do you filter through fairness? Do you filter through right and wrong? If you had all of these things, I'm not suggesting a company go out there and buy all these tools for one placement, but if you had a CEO or a senior leader, by all means, you should use some of these tools to know what you're getting. But let's say you have an employee group already, let's say 20, 30, 40 plus. If you ran these tools on people, that's one way to do it. Otherwise, you have to kind of go with your natural instincts, right? You have to go get trained on this stuff to know what to look for in behavior. And most leaders, frankly, that have never been trained or they've never used a tool, they are typically going to rely on what they know, which is usually what their parents taught them, their mentors taught them, or how they were brought up in the industry. Right.
And that can be dangerous.
It can be. It could be good because it kind of brings back maybe some of the old school subjective attributes that are brought into modern day. I have clients right now that swear by little goofy questions or tests in an interview that are age old. They're not objective. They're just subjective, but it's real in that moment to see how they respond.
Sure.
It's not the end all be all to the interview, but they believe in some of these old school methods.
Right.
But in this day and age, the thing is, we have so many things in our fingertips. You have apps on the phone. You have these tools, and they're so inexpensive. 5 years ago, even, some of these tools I mentioned were out of the reach of a lot of companies' budgets. Some of these tools now you can get for $39, $49, $50 per, just to be able to say, hey, I have turnover in this position, or I've got culture issues. Heck, go invest $50 times 20 employees, right? $1,000, whatever it is, to go out there and invest in your company to find out what you're dealing with.
Right.
That helps a leader identify what's sitting across from them, whether it's a VP of sales, a marketing coordinator, or somebody that's in finance. You're going to have 3 different mindsets based on the gravitation of their talent skills in that particular position.
Right. There's personality in that analysis, and then there's the relationship fit, how they like to talk amongst each other, and that's fascinating. Is that something you lead in with when you go into an organization?
The tool itself?
Yeah.
I don't lead with it. I mention it. I'll give you an example. I just spoke at a conference of insurance brokers in Indianapolis. It's their annual event. They had 90 or so independent insurance brokers from all over the country. So for 4 days, these are thought leaders, people that have been in the industry 20 plus years. And at the very end, they asked me about, well, what do you do? How are you involved? How can you help a company like us? And I talk about, of course, experience and all the stuff that we're talking about today. And I weave in, by just show of hands, I'll ask how many folks in here as a leader use any kind of tool, whether it's through training, recruiting, or hiring. And typically it's about half or less use a tool. Most of them that use a tool have used it as a one-off, and they don't use it consistently. This last group I just did, there was 90 companies represented. So there's only maybe 50 people in the room. They weren't all there. Not everybody makes the conference, but let's say 52 leaders that were there. I think we had 15 individuals. These are leaders. These are people that are doing very well, very successful people. 15 or so that had a tool they used with consistency. And of the 15 I had a chance to talk one-on-one with and really drill down, maybe 5 of those actually do it effectively and do it the right way. Most people just think if you have somebody fill out a survey, takes 10 minutes, you review it, hand it out to your team, that your team's going to all of a sudden, oh, well, I know Patrick. Now, Patrick's an extrovert. Now I know how to work with them. No, you don't. You gotta take.
You're just aware of it.
Yeah, you're aware of it. Yeah, it goes back to that third. You're consciously aware of Patrick. But now let's take it to that 4th level. Let's become unconsciously competent to deal with a guy like Patrick because you've trained yourself.
Right. Does change, you'd be surprised. I know we've come a long way in getting organizations to, get the profile systems in place to where we can get the science and the data behind personality styles and relationship fits. But does that help implement change in an organization? Because some changes we don't want to make. We want to keep things the way they are.
Usually it's not change. It's building upon, it's learning about, and creating awareness. It's one of the three. Typically, it's not, hey, let's bring this in and revolutionize our culture. Let's not take this tool and figure out who should be on the bus and who shouldn't be on the bus. I don't recommend that. Even in hiring, frankly, it's discriminatory. You can't take one tool and it'd be the sole factor for hiring a position. That's like saying if you didn't go to
it can help you ask certain questions,
absolutely.
Right? Guide
That's
the conversation.
Exactly what it is. It's a factoring tool in the interview process. You still have to look at their resume, their education, their background, stuff to interview them, check the referrals. And this is a slight percent. Somebody asked me, well, if you had to put a percent on it, what would you say? I'd say max 20%, 25%. The other 75% is everything that's on that resume and the feeling you get and what people say about them and the vibe that they put across in that interview process. That 20 to 25% only creates conversation. Hey, Patrick, I see on your profile that you took that you're not a very outgoing guy when it comes to cold calling, closing sales, and being in front of people. Tell me about that.
Right. Tell me a story.
Give me a chance to explain. So I'm not going to judge you on paper because the graph says that you're 20% dominant, that you're not going to succeed in a sales position. You might say, Mike, that thing is accurate. I hate public speaking. I'm not a closer. I'm a relationship builder. But you know what? I've been doing this 20 years and I figured it out. I know how to do what we call in behavior, adapt.
Right.
I know how to adapt my style to a different type of personality. And that's really important. What I say in hiring and training is don't just necessarily look at their nurture nature, what we call natural style. Look at how they've trained themselves to create awareness and adapt to different types of people. That's where you see someone who's effective.
Interesting. Are there any other thoughts that you want to share on any kind of, I know you mentioned pattern interrupts throughout, not the conversation, but you've done it. Is that important to sort of step back and approach things differently?
Well, yeah, I mean,
just in our approach in leadership.
I always say that the easiest analysis one could ever give is identify one area of self or company or team where you're not doing well. Right. I don't want to say you're doing poorly, but you're not a level 10. You're a 6 or 7, or it's struggling. It's a challenge. Identify that one level of self or team or company, put a microscope on it, put a question mark on it, curiosity, and say, why is it that we're not getting the result in this area, question mark, and then brainstorm it yourself and with team and identify why it's not happening. And then you ask the $1 million question, what are we going to do about it? Third quarter's around the corner. New Year's around the corner. If we're going to innovate, do what great leaders do, confront the brutal facts and make change, and we're going to create higher level of awareness around this challenge area, we have to put a microscope to it and we have to make changes to it. And then you have actionable things. That's where a lot of people, first of all, they don't want to look at the deficiencies. I see this all the time where I ask a leader, just happened last week. I said, why don't you do a corporate survey? You have corporate culture issues because you have 3 different departments that just don't talk to each other. And they're all over the map on what if they're happy or not. I said, you have a leadership perspective. You just brought me in as a consultant. I just met with the 3 different departments at a lower level on the org chart. I'm hearing 3 different things that don't match what you say.
Right, absolutely.
So let's take it out of your hands.
And they're not volunteering that information because
they're not sharing it with the boss because there's retribution potentially. Right. They're playing the politics game. But when you bring a trusted resource, and I'm pretty good in that regard. I like to talk to people at their level and say, hey, look, I'm trying to make you better. I'm not here trying to oust you of a job. I've done this 18 years. I have never caused anybody to be fired. I'm not that type of consultant. I'm a coach up guy, not a coach out guy. If you're going to hire me to coach your people out, I am not your guy. That's just my belief system and my value system. So this happened, right? At the end of the day, he calls me on the phone. He says, what do you think we should do? I go, it's real simple. You should develop a 15 to 20 question survey that hits the issues. Okay, let's take it out of your hands and your leadership hands. Give it to the people anonymously, truly anonymously. Let's ask all 50 people what they think and let's look at what they say. Okay.
Right.
Now we know the issues there. That's why he brought me in. I put a microscope to it. Now it's magnified. I just offered a potential solution, and there was pushback.
Right.
Whoa, I don't know. This could open a can of worms. And well, what are we going to hear? I said, why'd you pay me?
Right.
You brought me out here to look at what's underneath the hood. It's like a mechanic. The mechanic's telling you need a new motor.
Right.
Wow, that's a lot of money. Okay, well, you keep driving this thing in, but it's not going to go but another 100 miles, and you're going to have to get a new car. So you either pay $1,200 for a new motor, or you pay $15,000 for a new car. You pick.
Right.
It's the same thing.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the challenge I think that companies face, is that they don't want to confront the brutal facts. They know they should. Mm-hmm. They know that there are issues at hand at some varying level of the organization, but to be able to sit there and it's a tough thing. I mean, imagine we're leaders of companies. You put yourself out there. I have 40 coaching clients right now, individuals that represent 40 different companies, 40 different verticals. And if I went out and said, Mike, come up with the 20 areas you're most insecure about. Mm-hmm. Mike, you come up with them. And I write them out. And then I give them to my clients and say, okay, rank Mike 1 to 10 in these areas. Now, they don't know that's my insecurity. They just said this is feedback.
Sure.
And if it comes back, wow, Mike, 0 to 10, you're like a 4 in these areas. This is reinforcing what you already know. What are you going to do about it? Now action has to be taken. But my belief is it might sting, but that's where you grow. Right. That's where you truly grow as an individual. That's why these objective tools are great. You may not want to see the results. You may not want to hear that you're an introvert when you think you're a pretty funny guy at the party. Mm-hmm. When the survey says you're not. Or you can see this they do these in couples. Right. I have so many couples I look at and I'm like, Larry, you and I could sit there on the sidelines in 5 minutes and go, we had issues. We have this simple survey that would take them 10 minutes each to complete, objectively, totally irrelevant to each other, but they don't want to do it. Because it's going to show the spots and say, wow, this reinforces the fact that I'm a stoic communicator and my wife's right. I don't share my feelings. Okay, well, that's the point. Do you want to lose your marriage, or do you want to work on it?
Right. Yeah, having that awareness allows you to make the changes. But and a lot of times, if you gather the information and you don't do anything with it, it's even worse. But at least it sends the message that you are interested in understanding, right? And you value what they think and what they feel. Right. And when you have that information, you can make business decisions that can move the business forward.
But what's interesting, I was meeting with a couple of doctors here in the Valley, and they have an interesting model with everything that's happening with healthcare.
Well, they're struggling to talk to patients, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a whole other podcast you and I could talk about. But these guys have figured out a way to create a subscription model for patients. So for X amount of dollars a month for care, whether it's individual, kid, or family, it costs X. And here's what you get for it. But you pay cash. We don't care about your insurance. Doesn't matter if you need a cortisone shot, you need a Z-Pack for your nasal issues, you need an annual checkup. It's part of your deal. It's brilliant. I mean, this is happening, by the way, around the country. I've noticed because one of my niches is healthcare. And I was sitting there talking to these guys last night in the meeting. My wife and I had met with them, and these two doctors, very respected guys in the community. And they were saying, Mike, you know how it is. I mean, you're a guy. Do you know how many guys don't want to go to the doctor? Mm-hmm. They know something's going on in their body. Yeah. Wherever it is. But they won't. They won't until it's too late. This is the same. And I laughed because it's true. Because I have family members. I've been there myself at certain junctures of my life. Now with kids and, being, later in my life, I take that stuff more seriously than maybe I did in my 30s or my 20s. Right. But I see this in business. I see this with people's health. I see this with people's marriages. People don't want to face the brutal facts. If we just kind of not fight, kind of get along and just kind of keep things going, keep the peace, we're good. If I can, still get up and wake up and walk on 2 feet and see, and my heart beats, I'm okay.
Is this something we've learned early in life and we haven't, it's like it
is
a habit?
It's almost like the natural thing that we have is fight or flight, right? That's instinctive. So when you think about pain and pleasure in fight and flight type of mechanism, we want to avoid pain. We do anything and everything to protect ourselves, mind and body, to avoid pain. So even when we feel certain things, whether it's physically or mentally, to go pull that open and look at it, whether it's an X-ray, an MRI.
That's painful.
Therapy.
Understanding it.
Boom, you've just ripped it off.
And I'm going to avoid that at all costs.
All costs. This is the problem. When you truly subscribe to that belief that I'm going to confront the brutal facts in my reality every single day in every pillar of my life. Pillars is things that support you, right? Family, friends, career, health, fitness, etc. That's a very powerful individual, because that person may not be perfect, but they're committed to that journey of personal development.
So in talking about it with executives and knowing that these character styles are in place, and it may be a pain to pleasure. I mean, you could talk about, hey, when you get these things right, you'll grow your company by X return. And that's the vision, the pleasure part, right? And that's not driving decision, because that's not what's driving them. And so if you look at it like, if you don't do something, the opportunity cost in the marketplace is this.
Right.
Per person times this and revenue X and whatever, and you start evaluating and bring awareness.
Right.
That was it conscious
competence
to the financial missed opportunity or the financial cost.
Right.
Maybe you can get some.
Well, think about this. You talk about multifamily, for example. You have all of these innovations within the industry, whether it's communications, software. You and I were chatting a little bit about how the automotive industry is coming into this space, and you can speak to that, way better than I. But that's interesting to me. If you live in a community and you have all these great technologies out there that are app based, let's say whether it's a bicycle or a car that's part of being part of your community, you can use the car, use the bike, and that's an added value to that community. Okay, hear me out. The community looks at it and goes, God, that's a great idea. I can see how we would get higher ratings. People will be attracted to us. Oh, wait a minute. How much is this going to cost us?
Right.
They look at the cost of it rather than the value of it.
Right.
So that's the pleasure
Price
sale.
Versus,
This is the pleasure sale. We're going to tell you how great it's going to make you look. Well, then they pass on that opportunity. Guess what? The competitor down the street's doing it, and now they passed on it. So now the pain sets in. Well, they're losing market share, and everybody's raving on everything, whether it's Yelp, online surveys, and saying this community is amazing. They actually provide transportation within the community. It's like a concierge service, much like being at a hotel and have a shuttle service. Imagine that. Hotels have been doing that for decades. And we rant and rave about
W, right?
Yeah, or wherever. You see certain hotels, you're not going to get it. And the other ones we pay extra because we're going to get it, whether it's airport, shuttle, or otherwise. So now this company who passed on it feels the pain.
Right.
It says, oh, now we have to spend the money. Guess what? Now it's more expensive. You already lost market share. So your lost opportunity is more than it was when you had an opportunity 90 days ago to do it.
Right.
So it was the pain that triggered it rather than the pleasure of opportunity to be first mover.
Wow.
You see it all the time.
Yeah. And you're just playing catch up.
That's it.
Yeah, that's great. Those are some great thoughts. Anything you want to leave our listeners with, Mike, before we wrap up?
One thing I will say, I was talking a little bit off air. The awareness model is a term I gave this a long time ago. That's not something you would see like in a biology book or a behavior book. I was just looking at this when I learned it, because it's so many different authors and behaviorists and speakers that talked about these 4 things in different ways. And I started thinking, well, this is how you learn. This is how we become aware of things. So I'd call it the awareness model. So if you were to Google it, you might find maybe a blog on my website, MikeLindstrom.com. You won't see a ton out there, frankly. There are some people who've touched on it, but I'm really big on it. It's part of every aspect of when I do a training, I include it. I'm going to do a training this week for a big insurance company. And these are literally students right out of college. This is their first sales job, 22, 23 years old. First job. And I'm going to teach them at 22 years old in this training that you need to understand this model. You're coming into this class for 3 days and you're going to come in here. You don't know what you don't know. Okay. Before I open my mouth today, you're at level 1. By the time I walk out of here in 3 days, you might peak to level 3 where you're consciously competent to something, but there's no way in hell you're going to have fluence about any of this. You're not going to be fluent at any of this stuff until you go out and you fail and you get repetition and you practice. So maybe in a year when you come back, you can say, Mike was right. 365 days later, I have this many repetitions. I have this much pattern recognition. This is now I know how to answer certain questions and see what's coming at me. And maybe I'm starting my journey towards being fluent. So I challenge people, just go out there and get your reps in. Just like working out, like a muscle, the mind's no different. Same thing with pattern recognition.
That's great. I love the test your assumptions, get out there and try things. It's always a pleasure having you in the studio.
Thank you so much.
Mike.
I love it.
Yeah, thank you.
Good luck.
If you get a few moments, please subscribe, rate, and review this show on iTunes or on your own favorite platform. This helps others discover our program, and it tells us that we are doing a good job.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the Multifamily Leadership Podcast. For show notes and other resources, visit multifamilyleadership.com.